Fighter Alpha 3. Here comes a new challenger. That's enough! Unbeatable!
This is the Lukefitz Street Fighter Alpha 3 podcast with your hosts, Quest and Lukefitz.
It's showtime!
Hello and welcome to episode 9 of the Lukefitz podcast. If you couldn't tell, that was my homage to the famous video introduction of today's guest. Now, this man needs no introduction, but I'll provide one anyway by reading a brief excerpt from his Twitter description. 68k YT, as in YouTube, subs, experienced pro wrestling villain, British retro gaming god, delightfully devilish. And nothing could sum it up better. And it's an absolute honor and privilege to welcome Richard, the creator of Top Hat Gaming Man, to the show. Now over to you, the Quest, to start the interview.
Thanks, Luke. Welcome to the podcast, Richard. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And thanks for waking up early to come on.
Yeah, not too bad. 11 o'clock, been up. I've got a son who's 19 months old, so I've already been up about 5 hours by this point anyway.
Oh, that's
You're not
good.
on the true gamer timetable anymore.
No, sadly.
Yeah. Like growing up, what was the first console you had?
Oh, that's an interesting question because I was actually gaming pre-console era in Europe back in the days where people were predominantly gaming on microcomputers. So I had an Amstrad CPC 464, which I inherited from my uncle. I believe he gave it to me when I was 3 years old. In terms of consoles, though, the first one I had in my house was my uncle's again, a very big gaming influence in my life. It was a Super Nintendo. So Super Nintendo is what I started out on.
Did you have a favorite game on the SNES?
In the early days, it happened to be Street Fighter 2, strangely enough.
Wow.
When I was really young, I must have been about, 6 or 7 years old. He never used to actually let me play on the Super Nintendo. I used to just have to sit in his bedroom watching him play, like fantasizing about having to go on this game.
Sitting in your uncle's bedroom fantasizing. It's a bit of a weird, weird scenario.
Come to think of it. But I would be desperate to get my hands on this console, and he would always be like, "It's too expensive. You're not allowed it."
Wow.
However, there was an event that occurred that changed all of that. And that was when I started going around to one of my school friends' houses, playing a Sega Mega Drive, playing Sonic the Hedgehog.
Oh, the dark side.
Yeah. So then I went home to my mother and was like, wow, my friend's got this amazing computer, because we just called them computers at the time. And he's got these great games like Sonic and Streets of Rage. So I really want one. So my uncle was a little bit more tech savvy than my mother. So she went to my uncle, should I get him a Mega Drive? He's like, no, don't get him that. That's old tat. You want to get him a Super Nintendo? Here, he can borrow mine. So from there, I ended up borrowing his, and I believe I had a copy of Street Fighter 2 on there, Super Mario World, and Star Wing, which is obviously Star Fox to some parts of the world. And I absolutely fell in love with the system and gaming in general up until this day.
So in your early days of playing Street Fighter, did you have like friends or a brother to play against?
Strangely enough, because my uncle, there was only a 12-year age gap between us, I would play with him a lot. And I remember getting particularly angry with me at points where we didn't really know what we was doing, but I would like block him in the corner. He was like, stop blocking me in the corner, that's cheating, and stuff like that.
Yeah. Did you play the Alpha games when you were a kid, or did you only play them recently?
What's my story with Alpha? I first remember coming across it. We had a popular magazine in this country called Nintendo Magazine System, which I guess would be the equivalent of Nintendo Power Magazine. It was the official Nintendo mag in this country.
Nintendo Magazine System.
Yeah, it was called Nintendo Magazine
Interesting
System.
name.
I believe it transformed its name in later years and became known as Nintendo, just Nintendo Official Magazine.
Okay,
It was Nintendo Magazine System in the early days. And that's where I first remember seeing the Alpha 2, actually, I believe, because that came out on the Super Nintendo in the later years. I think I first probably played it on either the Sega Saturn or Sony PlayStation. I'm not really sure. But I've now got multiple copies. Like I've got a box copy on the Super Nintendo. I've played it across different platforms. And one story I was telling Quest actually prior to this podcast was over in the United States. I attended an arcade convention in 2011, and I was having some fun playing the Alpha 3 cabinet they had there. And there was like a 12 or 13-year-old lad who came up to me and noticed I was playing so badly, he felt the need to show me how to perform certain moves and stuff.
Wow. Yeah. So that's an interesting link. Like, I feel like most of us are coming from the more kind of competitive Street Fighter side. Definitely. So it's really... sorry, you go.
I'm just saying that I've noticed from many of the comments I receive in my comment section that is definitely a big demographic of viewers.
Yeah, so it's really interesting and refreshing to see videos from more of the casual perspective of what people think about Street Fighter. We'll get into your Third Strike video particularly a bit later because that's a lot of ground to cover there.
But we came into contact with you after you used some footage from our YouTube channel.
Yep.
What did you think of the channel, and was there any footage that stood out to you as a casual player?
Well, for me, the reason why I selected footage from your channel, because it was one of the only ones I could find with footage of the characters who got included in, was it one of the later iterations of the game? So I believe it was Fei Long, the Super Street Fighter one. So Fei Long, T-Hawk, etc. DJ.
Yep.
So that's what drew me to your footage, was you was the only people I could find who had caught decent footage of those characters in action.
Yeah, okay, and you specifically wanted those upper and max sort of extra characters in your...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I needed a good source.
The guy who made that footage is extremely proud of the fact that he's got some of the only footage out there of certain combos with those characters, and he's a real fanboy of that specific version of the game. So he'll be very happy to hear you say that.
That's amazing. Because like I said, I don't consider myself a good enough player of the games to be able to use my own footage when it comes to Street Fighter titles. I'm more into, like I said, the history of it and the legacy and the overall impact it's had on the gaming industry as a whole.
Yeah.
So on the topic of Alpha 3 Max, I heard that you plan on making a video covering it. Is that true?
Yeah, like my long-term goal is to pretty much make a standalone video on every single entry in the Street Fighter series, and maybe even long-term the majority of fighting games.
Sorry, by every entry, do you also mean iteration? Like you're going to do the Game Boy one?
Yes,
yeah, you got to watch the channel more, Quest.
I do, but for Alpha 3 Max specifically, because I know they've got a Game Boy version, they've got a PSP version, they got
the PSP,
all these different ones.
And that was it to me. I felt that the Max and the PSP version, where the PSP version and the GBA version of those games were too different to the versions that have come before it to just whack it all into one video. I felt that the handheld entries need separate videos down the line.
I look forward to those. You mentioned in your Alpha 3 vid that you prefer Alpha 3 to Alpha 2. Like, what are the things you liked about 3 more?
For me, it's just the huge roster selection you've got in Alpha 3. The fact that you've got all of the lovable characters from the Street Fighter 2 series, all 17 of the main ones, and then you've got a load of other characters on top of that as well. For me, coming in as such a big Street Fighter 2 fan, to have all of those characters plus a load more, I just thought that was great.
So I saw in one of your videos you describe yourself as a lifetime collector, and you kind of mentioned it then. Yeah. Like, how did you kind of transition from a kid, interested in gaming that, many people are, to like a serious collector?
It kind of happened organically. So I was always into collecting things. Again, I had a lot of influence from my uncle thinking about it. Like, because he was only 12 years older than me, I would get a lot of his old hand-me-down sometimes. Like, I got his childhood Star Wars toys from 1977.
Ah, wow, yep. That could be worth a lot these days, right?
Yeah, and even as a 9-year-old, I remember watching the Antiques Roadshow, and another child had brought in his Star Wars collection, and that really impressed me. So it made me look at all the ones I already had. And from there, at 9 years old, I ended up heading out to the boot sales and collecting more Star Wars figures I didn't have. And then you had, in 97, I believe, they re-released the original Star Wars trilogies, like director's cuts in the cinemas.
Yep.
So that made Star Wars mainstream again. So I got really into that. As the years went on, they became rarer, and they just slowly began to dry up. So I was just still going to boot sales and finding other things that interested me. I'd noticed that all the old Sega Mega Drive games, this was by the early 2000s we're going into now, the Sega Mega Drive games and the Master System games were all like 50p to £1 each. And as I explained to you earlier in the show, the Mega Drive was always a system I wanted as a child, but never had because I went for the Super Nintendo. But suddenly I could have a Mega Drive as well and buy all the games for like dirt cheap.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it happened. It happened organically just by going to boot sales, and I built up a big collection, and I've just had a lot of fun with it over the years.
What's the most prized item in your collection, or like the one that means the most to you?
Oh, I'm going to bring up two here. There's two games that mean a lot specifically to me. First is the PAL. I've got a PAL boxed copy of Mega Man X3 for the Super Nintendo.
Okay. Yep.
And basically, the Mega Man series has always traditionally performed very badly sales-wise in Europe. Because I believe it got a foothold. It's probably the same in Australia, actually. It got a foothold in the market on the Nintendo Entertainment System in the US. Yep. And obviously, the Nintendo Entertainment System was really only mega popular in the United States and Japan. So Mega Man never had an opportunity to organically grow. So I had a lot of fun as a child playing Mega Man X on the Super Nintendo and Mega Man X2. And Mega Man X3 was one of the system's late releases. So it was made in extremely limited quantity in a region where it already wasn't popular. It was a game I always looked for. And about 20 years after its release, I ended up paying quite a large sum of money to add it to the collection because I just wanted it so badly. And the other game I'd like to bring up is I've got a boxed American copy of Earthbound.
Oh, wow. That's pretty rare, isn't it? Like,
well,
it's often brought up as a rare one.
Yeah, and the reason why that one means particularly a lot to me is because I actually purchased that one from my biggest wrestling payday. So I had a short stint working for a company called TNA Wrestling in America. Impact Wrestling.
I used to be a big fan of TNA.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's crazy.
So you wrestled with TNA?
I had a really short contract with them in their prime on a show they were running called TNA British Boot Camp Season 2. They pretty much, mate, do you remember WWF Tough Enough in like 2001?
Yes, I remember. Didn't Rockstar Spud or somebody win that? Yeah,
Rockstar Spud won Season 1 of British Boot Camp. I was in Season 2 and was one of the 16 finalists.
Oh, nice. What was that like?
It was surreal because I took up wrestling as a hobby whilst I was at university in 2007, and this was in a time period where smaller guys, like I'm only 5'10", didn't really go anywhere, especially if he was from the UK. Like anyone who'd been exported from the UK previously, like the British Bulldog or William Regal, for example, were giants. So as a small British wrestler, I never foresaw myself doing anything of impact, to excuse the pun. So to do that, it was great. And in some ways, I'm a bit regretful that I didn't pursue wrestling more seriously when I was younger to be in even better condition when I did all that. Because obviously I never foresaw a time where smaller wrestlers would be more valued like they are today. So I was competing in a land of giants in the early days.
What was your kind of persona as a wrestler? Like you said before, or in that introduction that I read out, said that you were like a villain kind of archetype. Like, was that what you were on the show? You can look it up on YouTube. There's old matches. I wrestled the persona of Richard Parliament, and pretty much Richard Parliament was a politician, but the character and the Top Hat Gaming Man are one of the same. They even dress the same. Oh,
yeah. So it was kind of a really smooth. It was a crossover show. It was a smooth transition. And in 2016, I was wrestling really regularly and running the YouTube channel side by side simultaneously. So it's kind of like a wrestling side project.
Did you have a favorite like UK wrestler?
I was always a big fan of William Regal growing up, so I definitely took some influence from him. Yeah,
same. I liked his villain role that he played. Yeah, so I guess he got some of that villainous kind of above everyone else sort of character.
Yeah, the snobbery, and I thought the snobbery as well transitioned perfectly into the channel in the early days. Because like the fighting game community, which we can get onto a little later, the collecting community, retro game collecting community, can be very elitist. So I felt it was quite amusing to parody such a character. of like this elitist collector.
Have you kind of had people misinterpret your videos as not being in character? Like, I feel like if you watch one or two, you may think that that's your actual persona. Like, has there kind of been some blurring of the lines there that you've found in comments or things like that?
100%, especially in the early days, because I was very much, because like I said, I started wrestling training in 2007. So I was very much of the old school kayfabe mindset where you never break character. Yeah. So even back, if I had have done this interview with you 4 years ago, the whole thing would have been in character. Yeah. So there was definitely some blurring of the lines.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
What motivated you to start a retro gaming channel?
Partially down to the fact that I already had a large game collection and knowledge base. So I'd always watched a lot of retro gaming content as well. So I'd enjoyed like the majority of people like the Angry Video Game Nerd, GameSack, Gaming Historian, a lot of the big American channels. So I did notice that there was less of a British perspective at the time. So I wanted to bring a British perspective to the table, and I also wanted to find an additional purpose for this large collection I've built up. And secondly to that, by 2016 I was 30 years old. So I was starting to become slightly worried about getting injured in a wrestling match, then not having anything to fall back on, really, at least hobby-wise. So I wanted to find fun doing something else, and YouTube just happened to be that thing I found.
So your safe fallback job was to become a YouTuber?
I wouldn't say it was a fallback job. It was a fallback hobby. Because basically wrestling, I always worked a full-time job alongside wrestling. I wanted YouTube to become my next hobby, if that makes sense. And it's just grown bigger than that.
Yeah, on what you were saying about the kind of American bias, I saw in one of your videos as well that you mentioned you felt like some of the microcomputers, like you mentioned the Amstrad, but also the ZX Spectrum and stuff like that were quite underrepresented. Like, do you feel like that's still the case, or what are your thoughts on that?
I don't feel it's anywhere near as much as the case as it was when I started 4 years ago. There's quite a few British retro gaming channels continuing to grow and grow. Got a lot of friends who are just really growing these days. Like say Guru Larry's approaching 400,000, Nostalgia Nerd 400,000, and Nostalgia Nerd predominantly covers microcomputers.
You got to catch up.
Yeah, I have. These guys started a couple of years before me, but I do want to catch them up. I've got there's a lot of big British channels around at the moment, so that gap is closing, I feel, with microcomputers being underrepresented.
Yeah, I've noticed the British flag in the background in some of your vids. Like, you got a pillow with it in your channel that has a British flag. Are you a patriotic sort of person, or is it just part of the character of Top Hat?
I'd say a bit of both with that one.
Okay.
This is Future Luke. I just want to apologize for the clicking that you're about to hear. That was me kind of tapping on the table. It's there for a little bit. It's a bit annoying, but it'll go away. Back to the podcast.
Look, I want to get into some of the YouTube game. So I really admire your YouTube craft. So some of your titles are amazing. So one of my favorites, and the caps are very important. The Mad History of X-Men versus Street Fighter and why it outraged people! Exclamation mark, question mark, rare gaming history. That's just clickbait gold. And also you're very good with the thumbnails, the titles, the kind of social media. Like, what's your thought process with that kind of stuff? Is that an important part of your channel?
1 second. Sorry, I can hear clicking. Is that me or you?
That might be me. Sorry.
Okay, so no worries. The aim is generally when I come up with a video, first of all, I think of a game I want to cover. Yep. But apart from that, then I have to find a good hook to go alongside it. Yeah. So I research the game, and then I find what's perhaps the most interesting element of the game, or something what people might not necessarily know about. So with the X-Men versus Street Fighter game, for example, the main hook I found was the disappointment with the PlayStation conversion of the game.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's pretty much how that works.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then do you make all the thumbnails and like post it and everything? You don't have some like a social media manager or something like that?
No, I do. I literally do everything myself.
Yeah. Oh, classic YouTube.
Yeah.
I want to get into maybe my favorite video of yours. So a bit of context on this. We mainly play Alpha 3 and Street Fighter 2, and we have a bit of a kind of healthy rivalry with the Third Strike players in Australia.
Yeah.
So I think we've definitely got a common enemy there. Well, maybe not enemy, but
Yeah.
you made a 40-minute video called "The Mad Story of Street Fighter 3 and its Delusional Toxic Fandom: Rare Gaming History." So I love that title. And I got some quotes from it just for people who haven't seen it. Some people love this game so much that they simply refuse to accept facts that the game was not as popular as others. This is the sort of idiocy I deal with sometimes. Do you have anything to say to the Australian Third Strike community that might be listening to this?
I think, like any community, like I said, you've got the elitists there, and again, people who refuse to accept facts. Street Fighter 3, as great as the series is, it did at the time not sell very well in comparison to Street Fighter 2 previously. Yeah. So and the mass market appeal on the game is seriously lacking. Like by the time Street Fighter 4 came out, a lot of people was like, what about Street Fighter 3? I don't ever recall there being a Street Fighter 3. Do they mean Street Fighter Alpha 3?
Yeah.
So that confused a lot of people. So the whole point was, when I made the original Street Fighter 3 video, not the one about the fandom, when I made the original Street Fighter 3 video, the whole video was about why aren't the mainstream market aware of Street Fighter 3, and why was it so overlooked at the time? And there were so many different reasons why that happened to be the case. But then that video obviously seemed to outrage a lot of people because they'd never seen someone upload a video on Street Fighter 3 before in a negative context, if that makes sense. Even though there was nothing negative about the game, it was all more about the negative marketing of the game and the appeal.
Yep, I get you.
I might not be remembering correctly, but we had a conversation before about your auntie and uncle. They owned a pub and they had arcade games. What was that like?
So my mother had a brother and a sister. The brother was the uncle I was talking about before, and she also had a sister who, and her and her husband in the 90s were pub landlords. So they would run pubs.
Landlord and lady.
Yes, exactly. But they would normally have an arcade cabinet in the pub, and the majority of that time, because obviously this was the early 90s, would be a Street Fighter 2 cabinet. So obviously,
of course, because it's so much more popular than Third Strike, as everybody knows.
Oh yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a Street Fighter 3 cabinet in this country ever. But the Street Fighter 2 cabinet, I would actually get to play like after hours when the pub was closed and before it was opened and stuff, which I always thought was really cool. Just being able to sit in a pub alone playing Street Fighter 2 in its heyday.
That's
I
nice.
think that's cool.
Did they get you like free food and drinks and stuff?
They were landlords, but on the basis that they never actually owned the pubs they run. So they would manage pubs on behalf of corporate chains. So I wouldn't actually get any freebies there, sadly.
Okay, fair enough. You're currently showing beat 'em up games. Are there any in particular you're looking forward to covering?
I feel like I'm slowly getting through the majority of the ones I was really keen to cover. So I'm looking forward to switching paradigms with regards to that soon. But ones I'm still really keen to cover, which I've not got to yet, but I will do very shortly, is the Simpsons arcade game. I'm very keen to make a video on that. And more importantly, the 8-bit home computer ports, which people don't seem to know exist, because apparently Simpsons was always a game what was locked to the arcades, which simply isn't true. It just was not on the Super Nintendo or Mega Drive, but it was on home computers. So I'm looking forward to doing that.
Wow. So that was an officially licensed, I didn't. Yeah. You're correct that nobody knows about it.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different ports of that I want to cover.
Yeah. Wow.
And I'm keen to start getting through the Double Dragon series as well, actually, because I've not even touched that properly yet. So those are some big ones I want to do.
What are you going to do if you run out of fighting games or beat 'em ups? Is that possible that you can get through every single game?
Fighting games, I think it's going to be very difficult. And if I wanted to stay doing fighting games after I've covered every game, which I can't see happening anyway, I could start doing more history on the actual fighting game community, or I could start doing lore videos on like individual characters.
Or perhaps when you finish like covering all the games, the new games now will be retro games by then. and you'll have more than cover.
Absolutely correct. We've also got in terms of the beat 'em ups as well. I do want to drift away from them soon. 'Cause like I said, I feel like I've nearly covered all the ones I'd like to cover, and I'd like to move on to other genres like run and gun, platforming, stuff like that. So I like to go really deep on particular subjects, because then it becomes really easy to compare and contrast one game against the other, if that makes sense.
Yep. How do you play these games? Do you play them on like arcade emulators and that type of thing? Or?
I've got a Raspberry Pi, and that's generally how I tend to play a lot of beat 'em ups.
Yeah.
You said you had an in-person encounter before, like with someone that was a 12-year-old, and they'll try and tell you how to play the game. Have you had a in-person encounter with like a competitive retro player that's a bit older? And has it ever happened?
No, not really, to be fair. When it comes to older people, it's generally on the keyboard rather than in person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because these days, it would be on the keyboard. Have you had people like stop you on the street and recognize you from the channel?
The weirdest one, actually, I believe it's only happened once away from conventions, and it was actually in your country, over in Australia.
Really?
Yeah, that freaked me out. Basically, I was on a long walk through, where was it? Oh, God. I don't know. It was in Sydney, in some quite hipstery sort of district.
Okay, Newtown or something.
I think it was Newtown, yeah.
That's where all the hipsters that play retro arcades and stuff would live, with beards and like man buns and stuff.
Yeah, exactly one of those sort of areas. And we was going past the coffee shop, and my wife was desperate to go to the toilet. So we went in this coffee shop, and we got inside, and there was loads of retro arcade cabinets everywhere.
Yeah.
And I just ordered a drink whilst my wife went to the toilet, and the man behind the counter was like, "Wow, you're the top hat gaming man."
That's awesome.
And I was like, "Wow, yeah, I am." And this was, bear in mind, I was in Australia 3 years ago, so I only had 6,000 subscribers, so that made it even more baffling.
Yeah, well,
and
people in Australia have fine taste in YouTubers, obviously.
Yeah, but it turned out what made it even stranger was that apart from the fact that he knew who I was, he also had a mutual friend of mine who I knew from wrestling. One of my wrestling opponents was his friend in real life. Wow. So it was really odd going to the complete opposite side of the planet to find someone who watched my YouTube channel and had mutual friends randomly.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite conventions that you've been to?
I do basically that. There's this convention in England known as Play Expos, and they run like Blackpool, Manchester, London, and Margate, and a few other areas. And I tend to do panels these days at most of theirs, so I really enjoy their ones.
Yeah, that'd be fun meeting all the fans.
It's quality, and I get to meet and work with other YouTubers as well, which is always fun.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, collaborating. Like you're collaborating with us today.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you having a lot of fun?
Yeah, it's great. It's good. Especially during lockdown, where I don't get to see people.
Yeah, true.
You're going to get a huge subscriber bump from this. There's probably at least, 10 or 15 sold listeners to this podcast.
Oh, that'd be awesome. And I will post this video as well in, what's it called? I'll put it in the community section or something. So you should get some kickback from this, I hope.
That'd be awesome. More people looking at Alpha 3 would be great, and obviously listening to our beautiful voices. You said you traveled around the world, and you did some gaming. Was it for gaming, or was it just to travel?
Basically, this all goes back to when I was 30 again. I mentioned I wanted to change elements of my life. So that it was the same year I started the YouTube channel, and I was due basically where you update your mortgage on your house. And where it had gone up in value, I noticed that I could take out a chunk of money. At first, I wanted to buy an additional property to rent out. But then the UK brought in some stupid law where you have to pay really high taxes and stamp duty if you own more than one property. So I thought that idea's out the window. But I've always wanted to travel. So I thought now's as good as any, really, to take the opportunity. So took out some money from my property and went traveling for a year. So went to Australia for a month, did the US for 3 months, visited 25 different states.
Wow, that's intense.
Spent a month up in Canada, a couple of months over in Greece,
Hungary?
a month month in Cambodia, a month in Thailand. Now later on, since I've become a full-time YouTuber and I'm working on a laptop all the time, that's when I've been able to visit other countries. So Hungary, prior to lockdown, that's where I was spending some time, because now obviously I'm working online permanently. I don't need one solid base, so that's why I can travel when I like now. There's the perks of being a YouTuber.
Yeah. So that's presumably where you filmed the handhelds around the world series.
That's where it started, on that trip.
I find that a really interesting series in that it kind of combines. It's like a travel cooking show, but it's like a travel gaming show. I really like that format. Are you going to continue to do handhelds around the world, or kind of what's the status of that series?
So basically when I was in Hungary, I shot loads of footage. So I've actually got 3 more episodes already made, ready to upload to the channel. And when lockdown ends, I hope to continue to do trips, filming more episodes in different countries. So it's definitely a big part of the channel. And again, it's something what came apart circumstantially at first, where I was doing the gaming reviews on my channel in 2016, and then 6 months into my channel's lifespan, that was when I went away. So I needed to think of something new what would let me carry on doing what I was doing, and that was handhelds around the world.
Yeah, that's amazing. When did it start to take off? Like, what was the moment when you're like, wow, this is actually starting to get a bit of a following, or really get some traction?
There's breakthrough moments, I suppose. Like 2016, the first year I did it, I don't think there was really any particular moment where it really broke out. I think I finished the first year on like 2,500 subscribers. It took 8 months to get the first 1,000. I remember that. And then it was the second year when I started covering, doing like in-depth retrospectives of different pieces of hardware. So it was a hardware video is what really first started getting views. So when I was especially when I was covering more obscure systems, like making half-hour videos on platforms like the Panasonic 3DO and stuff like that.
Yeah, stuff that people would be searching for that would not be covered in detail anywhere else, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of why the fighting game series has worked really well, because you've got lots of fighting game videos out there focusing on the community aspect, but there's not many out there focusing on like the commercial aspect of like the game's commercial successes, their impact on the mass markets and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's why the Third Strike video like annoyed so many people, is that in the Street Fighter community, like people that still play the classic games, it's up there as probably the most played or second most played of the like real retro Street Fighter games. So people it's antithetical to their worldview to see that, amongst the more casual players, it wasn't kind of the biggest game ever. It's really interesting seeing that split between the FGC, as it's known, and the the rest of the world.
It's kind of like how Earthbound would be to like a hardcore Nintendo fan compared to a member of the casual market, I suppose. Yep.
That's your first video on your channel, right? Earthbound.
Yeah, and that was partially because I was so proud of owning that copy, which I bought using the TNA money.
Okay, yeah. It's a tax write-off. If you use it in a video, it's tax deductible.
It is these days.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. One of the secrets of YouTube, I guess.
What is the most challenging part of making content?
What's the most challenging part? It does vary, really. Previously, it was. I'm trying to think. It is at different times. There's different challenges. So, what would be the biggest challenge at the moment? That's a difficult question, because I just feel really positive and upbeat at present. So I'm struggling to even think of a challenge.
Yeah.
But there are definitely a lot of challenges. I'd say the biggest challenges are in the early days when you're trying to get that ball rolling, and the longer you're generally making videos, the easier it is to create content that gets hits. I'd say one of the hardest parts I find, what I scrutinize myself the most with these days, is when I make thumbnails for videos. Sometimes I end up spending as much time making a thumbnail as I will do actually writing the script. Yeah. So I really scrutinize the thumbnails, because that's obviously the first thing people see and make a snap decision whether they're going to want to watch a video or not. So I'm going to say thumbnails.
Okay, yeah, good answer. Some some YouTubers say the search algorithm is working against them, or they are being unfairly demonetized. Do you have any criticisms of working with YouTube, or anything they could do better as a content creator?
They could do more to, I'd say, to tweak their algorithm to further favour evergreen content, what's got long-term value, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
For example, I make videos which people can watch on the day they're released, and then a few months later they'll be just as relevant, or hopefully even years later. Whereas other people will get just as many views just uploading a video on a new Nintendo Switch game being announced today and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Whereas those videos hold no long-term value. They're valuable for one day.
Yeah.
So
And they make one the next week about the launch trailer, and then one the next week about blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
So those videos become worthless very quickly. So if I feel any criticism of YouTube, they should do more to promote content of permanent value, if that makes sense.
I feel like people have started gaming that. Like, you see it with a lot of the podcasts now that, like, you know, obviously the biggest one is Joe Rogan, but everyone else is kind of following that model of you record some 3-hour long podcast, chop it up into 10-minute bits, and then record them, you know, upload them like one a day kind of for weeks. And they somehow kind of get picked up in the algorithm and like recommended to people at the same level as like very, you know, in-depth, like high production value videos like yours. So, you know, they're both 10 minutes, but one of them took 10 minutes to make and one of them took a week to make. Like, there is definitely a difficulty there, I reckon, as well.
Yeah, I've noticed there does seem to be some sort of algorithmic shift at the moment. I don't know whether it's actually the algorithm itself or whether it's lockdown that's changing people's viewing habits.
Wow,
but yeah, it is. I've got to be really analytical with all of this because obviously it's my full-time living.
Okay.
But I've noticed at the moment when I'm tending to upload videos, they're getting less immediate hits than they were before, but they are being viewed over a longer period of time. And my overall watch minutes are at an all-time high, which suggests that at the moment more of my older videos are being watched than they were before. So maybe they have changed something internally in YouTube. Or like I said, maybe it could be the pandemic what's changing people as a whole. I don't really know.
Yeah.
But this is all stuff to like scrutinize.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yep. What do you think of Vimeo and Dailymotion and those other sort of sites?
Sadly, I don't think at any point, anytime soon, anyone's going to be able to catch up with YouTube. Yeah. It's so embedded as the popular video platform for like independent creation that no one's going to catch up, sadly. Yep. So it'd be lovely if YouTube did have competitors, but it's just so hard at this point. It would be like a social media platform trying to rise up and beat Facebook. It would be like MySpace trying to beat Facebook or something like that. It's just people are very embedded in what they watch.
Yeah, well, Facebook defeated MySpace, so it's possible, but yeah, it looks unlikely at this point.
Yeah, but with distraction for so long, like I said, it would be difficult.
Yeah. Before this podcast, I spoke to you about your top hat, and you said your original top hat, you actually gave it away to somebody. What was the story behind that?
Wow.
Basically a friend of mine run a charity prize draw. So he found a load of YouTubers with subscriber bases and asked them if they would donate this and they would donate that. So he just asked me if I was willing to donate a top hat. I think it was for the charity Mind, mental health. So I literally gave him the top hat and someone won it in a prize draw. So unlucky them.
Amazing. Yeah. Were they a fan of yours already?
Yeah, strangely enough, a gentleman who lives in Florida won it, Sebastian, and he's actually a patron of mine as well. Wow, so luckily someone did win it who was a fan.
Yep. Yeah. I have a quote from one of your videos, Beyond the Hat. You said, I think the gameplay, like in relation to retro games, you said, I think the gameplay is marginally better than the majority of games that come out today. What are the things you like about retro games that are done better than modern games?
The pick up and play nature is the primary difference maker, in my opinion. The fact that you could before just plug these games in and straight away start having fun, Whereas the way they seem to be engineered these days, before you can even play the game, you often have to sit through hours of time wasting and tutorial to even be able to start sinking your teeth in. Developers these days expect you to invest a hell of a lot of time into a game before you get anywhere. And it's been that way for quite some time. Like during lockdown, for example, at the moment, I've been playing Persona 4, not exactly a modern game, but it's modern to me. It's about 12 years old. And so far I've spent like 55 hours on that game. And I think it took about 10 hours before I started getting anything out of it. So for me, that was the difference with retro games. Like if you play something like Mega Man X, one of my all-time favorite games, if you play the opening stage of that game, the game's intuitive enough for it to teach you how to play as you go along, rather than bombarding. And the same would go with something like Street Fighter 2, rather than bombarding you with walls upon walls of text and explanation on how to play a game. I just feel like they were engineered better, many old games, for simplicity. Less is more. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I heard a theory about why that's the case, that currently developers like can't make enough money off just the initial point of sale, but they also have to make money from DLC and like trying to convince people to like do microtransactions and stuff. So they want people to keep playing their game as long as possible. It's not just like a one buy, as soon as you've sold the $50 or 25 pounds.
Well,
that's
the
not
games
it,
today are, the games are getting bigger and bigger each day. So obviously the bigger they get, the production costs are continuing to go up. But if the bizarre thing is, if you go to a shop today and you buy a brand new game, you're paying less for it than I would have been going to Electronic Boutique in 1992 and buying a game, which is just ridiculous considering the production cost differences.
Yeah, thousands of people working on it, whereas some of the credits for Street Fighter 2 has like 8 people in it. Like,
exactly.
It's a joke. It's amazing. And that they created a game, as you say, that's so easy to pick up, but has depth such that people are still playing it, 25, 30 years later. Oh yeah, one other thing I was going to bring up. I saw, so you mentioned that it's kind of, it's basically a full-time job for you now, YouTube, is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
I noticed you're getting into the merch game. So kind of
just about,
bit of a budding Jake Paul or one of these guys. So you got shirts, jumpers, singlets, bags. Yeah. What's next in the Top Hat Gaming Man line? Maybe top hats?
I've had a lot of pressure from my audience. I think that's because they would think it'd be funny. They want Top Hat Gaming underwear, so I might look into that down the line.
Wow, okay. And another thing, this is that kind of entertainer.
Something else I would like to produce as well. I don't know whether just because I think it'd be funny, but it's retro and I think people might want it. I'm tempted to sell Top Hat Gamer Man VHS tapes. So episodes on VHS. I think that'd be quite amusing.
Yeah, the full Streets of Rage saga on a 2 VHS collection. That'd be awesome.
For your next Beyond the Hat episode, do you have any ideas at the moment what you want to do for it? Because I found that pretty interesting to watch.
Beyond the Hat was a strange one. I made that, when did I produce that? About 4 months ago. And sadly, looking at the watch retention and the overall views, it wasn't as popular as anything else I was producing, which I was putting down to the fact that if someone subscribes to a channel, they usually subscribe for very specific content, so the documentary style content. So I axed Beyond the Hat pretty quickly because I wasn't sure what it was doing to my channel, but I am about to bring it back on the basis that now my YouTube channel is heavily Patreon funded. So I'm going to make it a Patreon only show for the people over on that platform.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Is there any extra things that the Patreon people get?
Yeah, they get. Well, I like to think I give them quite a lot of stuff. They get episodes of Handhelds Around the World 1 month before anyone else. They get all of the content advertisement free. They get all the videos at least 1 day before everyone else. Access to my Patreon Discord, and they also vote on the majority of my uploads now. So most of the videos I've been putting out at the moment have been chosen by the patrons.
Oh, wow. Nice. Okay. What was your most requested upload?
I'm going to click my channel quickly. And then I will know.
Yeah, go for it.
what got the most votes? YouTube
Probably Third
videos.
Strike.
The sequel.
Oh,
video.
it was Turtles Tournament Fighters.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of people
That's
wanted
got a
to see
huge
that.
following. I never.
Yeah, and
never
actually,
picked that.
it's also in the last couple of months, it's been my most viewed video, 65,000 views in 3 weeks. So
Tournament. What? Oh, I'm not hip to this. I gotta find out about this game.
it's a Street Fighter 2 clone, basically, with the Turtles.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's three different versions of it, which all play quite differently.
I got one more question, unless we've got some more quests. What do you think is the fascination with retro gaming? Like, what do you put that down to? It seems like it's really big in just the cultural milieu at the moment, that lots of people are into retro games. Like, do you think it's the nostalgia factor, or?
The mainstream seem to put it down to nostalgia because in their mind, if it's old, it's got to be nostalgia. People are just wanting to play these old games to remember a different time. But personally, I think that's potentially wrong. Maybe if you're somebody who's going to go out there and buy a Super Nintendo mini classic edition or something like that and just buy it for the sake of it and just play the games once, then yeah, you're probably buying it for nostalgia. Yeah. But people like myself who have walls and walls of games, like I said, I think it's mostly down to the paradigm shift that's happened in gaming over the years, where you're getting such a different experience from these older games than newer games. Like, I find myself often playing old games I've never played before, so that's certainly not nostalgia because they're new experiences. I'm going to play games of that archetype, if that makes sense. And I think it's people wanting something more simple. In fact, I could bring this back round to Street Fighter 3 again. Or what was that game? What was it called? Capcom Fighting Evolution?
Yeah, the one that nobody played.
Yeah, it was by that point that Capcom basically pretty much pulled the plug on fighting games and just thought these are old hat. People aren't interested in them anymore. Yeah,
until Street Fighter 4 famously kind of reinvigorated the market.
Yeah, but the actual reinvigoration started just before that, actually. And the reinvigoration started with a re-release of Street Fighter 2 on the Xbox Live Arcade. It performed way better than Capcom expected. And because of how popular that was, that's what got Inafune clamoring for Capcom to produce Street Fighter 4. And so basically, Street Fighter 2, it saved the arcade industry back in 1991. And then in like the mid-2000s,
the second coming.
It saved the fighting game industry. So it saved two industries in two different decades. Like, that's a special game.
So my last question is, who is your favorite Alpha 3 character?
Alpha 3 character? Across all the games, I've always had, for some reason, a soft spot for Bison. Perhaps because he was the final boss in the original versions of Street Fighter 2. So as a child, I always looked at him as the persona. Yeah, I'm drawn to villains.
Do you think Top Hat is more evil than Bison, or do you think Bison is more evil than Top Hat?
That's a good question. Probably make a good team.
Yeah, true.
Cool. We might wrap it up there. Thanks again for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was a good fun chat. I enjoyed that.
Cool. Signing off.